Welcome back. Well, the Africa Report has compiled the latest ranking of Africa's best performing countries, which highlights the continent's most successful nations. South Africa has taken the top spot with an impressive overall score of 64.79, outpacing Egypt and Morocco. And joining me now to provide further analysis on the survey is a business editor at the Africa Report, Kanika Saigal. Thank you so much for your time, Kanika. Now, best performing countries, how do you characterize that?
So in our ranking, we looked at three key indicators. So one was governance, the other was innovation, and the other was influence. So the governance part took up the majority of the ranking. That accounted for 50%, and then innovation and influence was 25% each. And what we wanted to do this time was to look beyond, the normal ways in which African countries are ranked. So they look at, economic growth, or they might look at the Human Development Index. And we wanted to do something that was a lot more detailed, a lot more in depth, and create something where you could actually compare African countries side by side. So in terms of the governance issue, for instance, a lot of those were economic indicators, but we went back over 3 years because we wanted to understand the trends and the growth and the reality on the ground. And then what you see as part of that is if a country had had like a military coup in the last 3 years, for instance, I think they were removed from the ranking, or they fell quite far down. And then the other two pillars that we looked at, innovation and influence, was slightly more subjective, but I think gives much deeper understanding to how some of these African countries are performing.
Yeah, and it really is important to kind of expand performance analysis, because we know that a country is not just its GDP. Well, let's talk about South Africa sitting in first place. How did we do it?
So I think, again, over the three indicators, South Africa did relatively well. Governance, we looked at, there were some indicators where it actually was pushed down the rankings a little bit. So it wasn't in the top, I think 5 countries. And I think there were some questions around the corruption, FDI flows had been slightly lower, and GDP growth had been a bit more subdued. But then when you look at the influence and the innovation pillars of our research, you could see that they did really well. And I think, you see South Africa's role within the BRICS. You look at it, its role within the G20. You see how vocal it's been in terms of geopolitical events, and South Africa is way up there. On top of that, we looked at things like the number of embassies that a country has abroad, and South Africa, again, because of its diplomatic relationships, it has a lot. And then we also looked at things a little bit more interesting, would be the number of Spotify downloads, for instance, that had come out of certain African countries. So that was a really interesting indicator. And in terms of innovation, I think South Africa, again, performs really well, because you think it's got some of the best universities in the world. Some of the research that comes out of the country is incredible. And even when some of these projects aren't necessarily backed financially by the government, there is a lot of policy that is put in place to help support innovation across the board.
These are very interesting indicators that you have included here, and really just speaks to the kind of detail that you went into. Now, how far behind South Africa are Egypt and Morocco?
So they're pretty close. Again, if you look at the indicators, you'll be able to see in much more granular detail kind of how they compare. So next in line, I think, was Egypt, and then we have Morocco. And Egypt does really well because of its, of its positioning. It takes advantage of its geographical location between Africa and the Arab world. So acting as this kind of stepping stone into Africa, and I think that's what it's leveraged on. Also, a really incredible holiday destination. And I think that was shown as well in terms of the governance and the attractiveness of the country. Morocco performs really well in our score in terms of in the influence. Governance is relatively high as well as innovation. And part of that is around some of the financial services centres that they have. So Casablanca Finance City, for instance, a state-of-the-art modern tech-first investment city, that has really put Morocco even further on the map. And then you add to that again, you know, the tourism and the attractiveness as a country. I think, yeah, it does really well in our list too.
Okay, well, beyond the top 3 countries, you make specific mention of Anglophone and Francophone countries. What stood out in those country groupings?
So I think what for us was really interesting was, if you look beyond the size, beyond the GDP and the economic size of a country, some of these smaller countries were really kind of pushing beyond their size. So, and that's a lot to do with some of the influence bucket, the way we look at things. So if you think about Mauritania, for instance, big country, but maybe smaller in terms of economy. But obviously, the new head of the AFDB, Sidi Oltar, is now the head of the African Development Bank, and that's kind of pushes that country up the rankings. That you have Rwanda, which I think in terms of governance might not be so high, but when you think again about influence, you know, Rwanda sends the most blue helmets internationally than any other African country, so that pushes it up the ranking as well. I think Djibouti, the head of the African Union now is Mohamed Yusuf, who is from Djibouti, and so again, you know, it's kind of pushing beyond its weight a little bit. So those were kind of the interesting stories that came out of looking in detail a bit more at our rankings.
Well, that is indeed fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us some more insight into that. Kanika, I really appreciate your time. That was a business editor at the Africa Report, Kanika Saigal.